All right, without further ado, please welcome Mike Weber.
So we're going to talk about high availability, and I want to start with looking at some of the options. Many of you have probably looked at some of these options, and I want to look at some of the things that do and do not work very well. One of the things that a lot of people are doing is you've got it virtualized, and so instead of having really high availability, what you're saying is if we got an image, we can rebuild it in 15 minutes. I mean, that is a solution that a lot of people are doing just because they don't want the hassle of building something out. There's other options using synchronization. One of the problems with synchronization, and I've developed this model that we're going to look at because of some of the problems that I've seen, is when you synchronize your master server with your slave, if you have administrators that make mistakes on the master, you have the same problem on the slave. You really don't have high availability. You've got two big messes. Now, if you use a test server, this is a great option, and it's a better option using something like rsync or some kind of synchronization mechanism. But if you don't discipline your setup so that your master server is kept pristine, you're going to always have problems. So in this model, I've developed a situation where there is no synchronization because of the problems that I see that organizations wrestle with. Now, this may not fit with your organization, but this is why I've developed it this way. The other thing is clustered servers, and that's another option that you could use. A lot of people don't go that direction just because of the complexity. So what I'm trying to do is create a model that is easier to use, gives you some high availability, and gives you some options without spending a lot of your resources trying to make it work. Here's a couple of the options that you'll see on the internet. Redundant monitoring. Some organizations will say, okay, we want to make sure this is always up, so we're going to monitor everything twice. Well, obviously, the problem is if the Nagios server goes down, that's fine. We turn on the notifications. But the problem with this is you double your bandwidth, and that's usually not going to be acceptable. The other option that you see is when Nagios, you have a master and you have a slave. The slave is monitoring the master using NRPE. The master is pushing the history, which is very important for you because you've got your charting, what's happening with your checks, all that information. It's pushing it to the slave, and that's okay. But you're still monitoring with NRPE, which means that you are monitoring all of your hosts still because NRPE is up and running. Not monitoring services or notifications. And again, if it goes down, then you can see it switches over, activates those things. Again, not the perfect solution. So, in reality, the perfect solution may not exist. A lot of this depends upon your organization, the skills that your personnel have, what you want to do. The reality is everybody wants Nagios to be up. If the master goes down, your organization wants an option. And so this model is going to provide you an option that is about as simple as you can probably go. It's going to be a master-slave relationship. You're going to see here that the master is going to send the history to the slave. The slave will not be doing any monitoring, no hosts, no services, no notifications. That's all turned off. When it is also monitoring the master. So if the master goes down, the slave says, hey, my time to work, kicks everything on, starts up the process, and then continues to work that way. So this model is designed to be simple, but simplicity is kind of relative, and you recognize that. Here's the model. And I'll get up so I can point out a couple things here. This model, you've got your Nagios master, and you can see in the yellow that I've got performance tuned. So whether you're running core or XI, this works both the same way. You're going to want to have the same kind of performance attributes on both boxes. this is suggesting, you could do this with a virtual situation, but you could also do it with dedicated hardware. So you got your performance in place in both situations. Secondly, you see that the master is pushing the history to the slave. This is really important in your setup, because if the master goes down and it's in the process of doing 5 checks to determine a bad state has occurred in the first or second check, you get stuck with a time lapse if you're not keeping up with this history. So, of course, your history for your charting and all those kinds of things that you want on your slave if it takes over. So you've got to push your history. In the purple, you see that the Nagios slave is monitoring the master. This is a simple SSH connection running a script, and you're looking to see, is the process up? If the process is up, everything's okay. If the process is not up, then you're using a script to change the Nagios config, turn it on, and it uploads and gets going. Now, depending upon the size of your database, a small database, you may only have a 1 or 2 minute lapse between the master going down and the slave coming up. Now, that's assuming that you're monitoring every minute. If you have a larger database, of course, it's going to take a longer time for that database to kick in. And so you may have 6, 8 minutes, depending on your database. So that's the kind of gap that you're looking at here. And so just so that you know that aspect. Now, the other thing that you see here is one of the things you struggle with is you've got a slave. If it's not doing nothing, it's just sitting there. And that's hardware you paid for. So in this model, it's running mod Gearman. It's doing jobs for the master. So the queue on the master is constantly being processed by that slave. That slave is always doing something. So it's being productive for your system. The other thing that I usually tell people to do is to put NetFlow monitoring, so that NetFlow is going to the slave, so the slave is also doing all of the monitoring for NetFlow, collecting that information, NetFlow, SFlow, so that the organization has that tool in place too. The idea is to use the slave for as many things as you can, that if it does kick in, it doesn't get overwhelmed, but you want to use your resources as well as possible. The third option is to implement Puppet. Now, one of the problems that you have with a model like this is, and this is why people like the rsync option, is it's a lot of work to implement something on one server, then go to another server. And so this aspect of Puppet is actually a third server. So this is your test server, which has a dual role of being the test server. So if you're going to mess something up, you mess it up on there. But it also functions as a Puppet master. Now, with the new Nagios version 3.2, you can import your configs using with Nagios XI. And you can do the same thing with Nagios Core. So you can push Puppet configs to these 2 machines. So that then gives you the ability to actually manage one server. Once your configs are right, then you push them to the other 2 using Puppet. And so this gives you a great way to manage all of your system. You're only pushing out configs when you know they're right, and you don't have the problem with the rsyncing problems with administrators. So it is more work to set up, but it is important to have some of those features so that it works correctly. Here's the idea of Puppet. Test server, and it's pushing the good configs to the other 2. So when they're ready, you push them out there, and then you can work with those. So here's the steps. You have to be able to clone the master. Now, we're assuming that you've set up your network settings like you wanted to do, and so everything is pretty mature. You don't want to clone your master and keep pushing it over to the slave on a constant basis. You want this to be done once you've got your foundational network stuff all set up. So you clone it. You're looking at your databases, if this was XI. You're also looking at those important directories at USR local Nagios and Nagios XI. You got to get those pushed over there. There's a lot of configurations that are in there, and you have your plugins. You have to remember that your dependencies also have to be coincided here. And so that is one hassle, but again, if you would go to the Puppet direction, then you can maintain your dependencies on your 3 servers too. So that is one of those options. The slave has to have access to all your devices. I mean, this is a simple concept here. The problem, one of the problems with this is you're using 2 different IP addresses. And so that is one of the hassles, is that all of your devices have to allow those 2. Basically modify that nagios.cfg on the slave. You can see, simply turn off everything. So you manually go in there and edit those config files so that they don't do anything. It's just sitting there. And again, that's the reason for using something like Mod Gearman and putting NetFlow on it, making it do something while it's sitting there. The master is going to send all of your configuration using NSCA. You could probably use other passive methods, but this works pretty easily, and it's been a standard, so this is a pretty good way to push it. So, of course, you've got to set up your daemon on your slave so that it will allow the master, configure your firewall, whatever you have to do to set those kinds of things up. Here is an example. Now, this is XI. So remember, with XI, you have a couple other situations that you have to work with when you're working with NSCA. This is on the master. You have to allow outbound transfers. NSCA is looking for an IP address. It's looking for an encryption method, and it's looking for a password. So those 3 things are going to have to be configured on your Nagios master and the slave so that they can send this, and it's going to be encrypted. You may want to start with non-encryption just to get it going, but eventually you're going to want to encrypt it. It's a simple process to do, and it's just a matter of coordinating the encryption on the master and the decryption on the slave. That's all. It will create this file that you'll see in USR local Nagios etc. You could send this information to multiple servers if you wanted to, but this is the file that's created. It's going to have the password and the encryption level that you've chosen. And so that file is going to have the IP address attached to it. This is the simple config file for NSCA. Now this is on the slave, and you can see the allow host line is the important line here. You want to be able to probably put in the local host and then IP addresses. Notice there's no commas. So you could put multiple IPs in here if you wanted to. This is typically managed by Zynet-D, so that what you have to remember is if you make changes, you have to restart that Zynet.D, that daemon, to get that because it's managing this as a super daemon. This is the inbound transfers. So the inbound transfers are, you can see the encryption level. This is actually decryption, and the password. This just has to coordinate with what you have on the master. Simple stuff. But both of these on XI are in the web interface, and you need to remember to set those. The red indicator is to say, hey, have you set up the allow host line in the daemon config? So that's all it's saying, is helping you remind that is a necessary setting. Now, we have to talk between the slave and the master. And this is going to be done using SSH. It seems to be a logical situation. Remember, this is getting executed as Nagios. So you're going to do everything as Nagios. It makes sense to create your keys as the Nagios user and take a lot of the default settings. So if you have to edit your etc password file to make sure that the home for Nagios is home Nagios, then that might be something you'd have to do. But create that hidden SSH directory, create your key pair on the Nagios slave. So this key pair is going to be created with a little bit different, so that it's not going to have, it's going to have the -n and then in quotes there. So it's not going to have any content, but this will give you the ability to always connect up to your master easily. So it's going to create a key pair. You're going to have a public and a private key, and we need to push the public key to the Nagios master. And again, on the master, we are going to put this in the home directory for the Nagios user because everything has to execute as Nagios. You don't want to do this as root. You want it to execute as Nagios. When we push that key to the master, you're probably going to want to change the name. You can see id_dsa.pub. If there's another key pair in that Nagios home directory, you're going to overwrite the one that's there. So if you just change the name, here I changed it to slave. So it's going to land there and then just cat slave into authorized keys. Notice the two arrows, it's a append, it's not, you don't want to overwrite this in case there's something there. And make sure your permissions are correct because SSH won't connect if your permissions are wrong. So this is just a basic way to connect up to the master on a regular basis so that you can communicate and verify that the master actually is up. There's the cron job. This is a simple cron job. Every minute it's going to execute, and you notice that it's going to an event handler, which is check_master.sh, which is just this is what's going to trigger and reset that config file on the slave. So the slave is just sitting there constantly checking up to see if that master is up and using an event handler to do something if it finds a problem. And here's a simple event handler. You're going to see that basically it's using sed and just changing from a 0 to a 1 depending on the situation. So it's basically just connecting up, hey, is the process up and running? If it is, hey, don't worry. If it isn't, rewrite and then reload the config so Nagios rereads that and takes off. Again, this should take 1 or 2 minutes if you've got a small database, 6, 8 minutes if you've got a larger database for this to occur. So sometimes, quite frankly, your Nagios server may go offline and the master, and it may not be that long a period of time. It usually is going to come back up pretty quick. So anyway, it takes a couple minutes for it to make this transition. Again, part of the assumption with this model is that you're in a mature state. In other words, you're not going to add 50 new servers in the next couple weeks. It just doesn't make sense to go through all this work and then have to redo it again. Because obviously, when you add new hosts and services on the master, you have to duplicate that process on the slave. It's part of the process. So again, if you don't use Puppet, then you're looking at some manual activity. So you want to do this when something is more mature. This is also assuming that the master is down for a short amount of time. Most organizations that I see, if the master goes down, it is a major crisis. And it is a very important thing to get it back online as quickly as possible. One of the things that you do not see is the slave does not push the history back to the master. So if you had a situation where you were running the slave for a week, maybe you would want to implement that push backwards to collect up the history. But in this model, I didn't put it there because most organizations are going to get that master up fairly quickly. I have seen organizations that have run the slave for weeks based on the master was so hosed that it was a complete rebuild. So maybe that will happen, but typically that slave is not going to be up for very long. Typically, organizations don't put as much money into the hardware, so as a result, it doesn't have the responsiveness. You may get more latency. So it just depends on what your organization does for that slave in terms of an investment. The other thing is that I have found that it is important that they are independent. Again, I know the rsync idea sounds like, or some kind of synchronization sounds like a great idea, and it is if you can keep mistakes off of your master. If you have any mistakes on your master, then you're going to synchronize them and you have nothing. And that is a problem. This is a little more work, but in the long run, it may save your tail. You'll be the Linux or the Nagios administrator that everybody's going to be looking at and saying, hey, what do we do? How do we know if we're up or not? And so the synchronization problem can be extensive. So here's the example of the master. You can see up in the right-hand corner, everything is running. So it's functioning completely, functions just like any other Nagios server. And here's the slave, and you can see up in the right-hand corner, no host checks, no service checks, and no notifications. And it should tell you that visually. You can do the same kind of thing on Nagios Core, of course. This whole thing could function the same on Nagios Core. On the master, you've got your history of all of your service checks, and the same thing on the slave. The slave will then reflect those things that are happening. Initially, the slave, everything will say pending. Everything's pending. And so it's waiting for the history. So all the information that it collects has got to be that history from NSCA. Problems. Yeah, there will be some problems. And one of the problems that you'll find as I've worked with this is this. NSCA version 291 made a provision for a bigger buffer, which is a great idea. And so on the master, or on the slave, which has the daemon, this works fine. The NSCA daemon has a bigger buffer and it can collect the information. Unfortunately, with the client, when you use send NSCA, the larger buffer, it has a tendency to pull in information from other service checks. And so you will see this service check, you'll see your service check is a disk check, and you'll see information about users underneath it. So the buffer doesn't work quite as like everybody wants. So on the master, you're going to have to go back to 272. So you're going to have to use the 272 version of NSCA on the master until that's corrected. But initially, what I found is it's pulling in information that is going to be from other plugins. And obviously, that's not going to make you happy. OK. Questions? You got to wait until they bring you a...
Hello. I'm intrigued by how you're accomplishing like automatic reconfiguration in the face of Nagios QL. So like you're using you know, the event handler to reconfigure Nagios.cfg. Isn't like Nagios QL and XI just going to come back and overwrite that change with what it has in its database?
So what it should have is the slave, what you're saying, the slave should have the same history, should have the same database information basically as the master, because it should be keeping up.
So you're replicating the Nagios QL database?
Right. See, okay. You're going to import, remember, I think it was the first step, where you do a backup of the databases and all those config files to put on the slave. So basically, at one point in time, they're exactly the same, except for IP address, host name, etc. So that's why that database information is exactly the same. So it won't be able to collect the history if it doesn't see the database. If it doesn't know about the hosts and services, it has to be able to see those things.
So when the event handler fires, when the primary goes down, are you then going into like XI global config and also making that change so it persists?
Just making the change in the Nagios CFG. so that it turns on active checks for host services and also notifications.
Thanks. I think what you could do, or what you're looking for, is to use external command to enable notifications and active checks instead. In that way, you don't have to touch the nagios.cfg file.
And you could do that. I mean, there are the original, some of the original ones that I showed on there, that's exactly what they did.
All right. So I got another question though.
Okay.
About synchronization of configuration. Is there a way, I'm not an expert in Nagios QL, so I'm looking for, is there a way to replicate my configurations? I only have to do changes on one system.
I suspect there is a way. I haven't done that. Now, one of the ways to look at this, and this is what I was suggesting with Puppet, is because of the new ways of bringing in information into Nagios XI, those config files can be generated on one XI and then imported on the other. That seems to me, just in the situation I've looked at, makes a lot of sense just because of the mistakes that people make. And oftentimes I see administrators making a lot of mistakes with their databases, and so what you're asking is probably possible. I haven't done it, so I don't know. But I see the config files is a better way, easier way, safer way than to start messing with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Excuse me. You don't seem to make any provision for what happens to, like you said, when you run on the slave for a week, let's say, and you've got your history over there now. So there's also no provision for your slave, which you're saying, let's make it justify its existence and do work. What happens if your slave goes down in this scenario? Your master's still up, but your slave's not there.
Okay, so you're talking in reference to like Maud Gearman. Okay, so in this scenario, Maud Gearman, the daemon, the server, and a worker are running on the master, and another worker is running on the slave. So if the slave goes away, doesn't affect anything. So that would be, now typically the workers on the master are doing less work than the slave, because the slave's sitting there with all kinds of CPU cycles that you can use. So you want to get as much off of that as you can. But the trick, the important aspect there would be to make sure that if the slave goes down, the master is not going to stop. So you would want to balance your work that way. It may be slower, but you certainly want it to run. You don't want to depend on the slave.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is, suppose you have the slave, you're running off the slave, the master comes back up. What's stopping the master from writing over the information that the slave's currently collecting? How do you tell it to, all right, we're stopping the slave and we're going back to the master?
Well, the slave is going to stop automatically. I mean, as soon as, because we're checking every minute, as soon as it recognizes, your gap is going to be 1 or 2 minutes most for that slave to start shutting down. And so part of the answer to that is how quickly you check that master, because certainly you don't want them to be running at the same time. Now, as far as overwriting the information, the slave is not pushing anything back in this situation, so there's going to be a gap in your information. The assumption is we're looking at a short amount of time. If you were a situation where you're looking for a longer amount of time, you're probably going to want to push that information back to the master in some way, whether it's NSCA or using SSH to push some of those config files. You may want to think about some of those options. But again, the assumption is the slave's not going to be running for long, and it's going to turn off as soon as the master comes up. So that probably is not going to be an issue. But the longer you run, the bigger the issue will be, certainly.
Thanks.
Anything else?
I might have missed this, but have you seen or would you envision the slave being in a complete separate data center?
Well, and that's a good question. If this network goes down, what good is it to have a slave? So it makes sense to have it in a different location. You just want to make sure you don't have too much latency in your network connections, because you probably want that slave to be doing its job as quickly as possible. That would be the major consideration. But yes, it makes sense to have it so that it doesn't all go down. This is one of the problems with depending on virtualization, where you've got an image, but if the host is gone, you got no way to bring it up. And so then you're in trouble. So all of these, as I said before, are not really perfect. You wish they were better. But you have to look at your organization and your staff, what they can do, and try to figure a solution that will work with your situation. I think there's a question over here.
Just an XI-specific question. Let's say you've got an environment with, say 15, 20 XI users. With the model that you're looking at here, is that kind of just basically you create them on the first server and then manually just also create them on the second server?
Users?
Yeah.
You should end up with duplication because you're copying all that information over.
Okay.
I mean, again, the importance is once you get to a mature state, then moving that, so you almost clone the two servers to start with. So if you do add users to the master, then you're going to have to manually go over and duplicate that. There is that. Now, the other thing that usually with organizations that I've worked with that do this is I tell them, okay, you got to figure out a time when your master can be down for a very short amount of time. And maybe this is once a week on a Friday night or something. And then I tell them, make a full backup. Now I'm talking about shutting the databases down so you get a good backup of your databases, back up all those directories and put it in a file so that you could take that and redo that on your slave. So usually my reference is about a week, every week to do that. And most companies have a time slot. This only takes, well, if it's a huge database, it may take 20, 30 minutes. But that's the kind of thing that I also think you should do, because then it would fix some of those problems that you have in terms of users, et cetera.
Okay.
So I have my MySQL database is running on a separate server. So if I could figure out a way to make that highly available, how easy is it for then, if I'm not moving data around, for those two to share that database?
So in that scenario, you would want to for sure have some kind of high availability on your database, because obviously if that,
I'm assuming MySQL has some facility for that, right?
Okay. Yeah, you could do something. That would make a lot of what you're wanting to do easier. It would just be a matter of trying to figure out, you're not copying to the slave the databases. You do have some different configurations in terms of pointing them to the right directions for your database, et cetera. But it should work the same way, because of, it's just checking basic checks and then just kicking things on and kicking them off.
Okay, so if I have access to a load balancer for the front end, so in theory, if I had my users going through the load balancer, for XI access, then the back end should be able to switch between the two.
I've
Fairly-
seen a lot of theories, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You just have to try it to make sure. I mean, what you're saying makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's got to make sense for your organization. I mean, this model that I'm presenting, it's not going to work for everybody. But if
Yeah.
you can take that and twist it for something that'll work for you, that's the idea, is doing something that will work for your organization.
Okay.
Other questions? There are a lot of modifications that you could make off this model. As I've presented this to different companies, some companies pull off the puppet and say, hey, we can't do that. Some companies say, yeah, we don't want to use Mod Gearman. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. And you just have to, again, twist this thing, this concept, and use it, pick out the things that will work for your organization and use those, and then discard the other things or wait till later to development. It is a lot of stuff to develop at one time. And it may be a project that you develop over a number of months as you go through stages to make it happen for your organization. So. Nothing else?
Can you talk a little about how you're using Mod Gearman within your Nagios setup?
Okay, so Mod Gearman, when I go to an organization and set up Nagios, most of those setups are bigger. And I'm talking 3 to 10,000 checks. If you keep MySQL on your Nagios server, and you have XI, you're going to have to do some performance issues. It's just, if you move off Nagios or MySQL, then you have some options. But if you keep it on the server, which many organizations want to because they're nervous about the complexities of having 2 boxes. So if you do that, you have to do something about performance. Mod Gearman then on the Nagios server is always set up. I always set it up as the daemon and a worker on Nagios itself. So it's always doing jobs for itself. And then try to set up another box to be a worker as well. So you can offload that. But even setting up Mod Gearman on Nagios XI, it will reduce the load by just doing work for itself. It doesn't seem like it, doesn't make sense, but the client takes so little resources and is so productive, then it can really save you some resources. And then, of course, you could have as many workers as you want. I mean, you could drop that on those servers that you have that are running at 70%. You want to pull 5% off to do work for Nagios. It's a great concept. The only difficulty with that is that worker also must have the complete access that Nagios does. In other words, you got to have the plugins, you have to have any of the dependencies, and you have to have the permissions to get access to all of those boxes. That's the problem with 20 workers. That sounds great, but then you're looking at a lot of IPs. Now, you can also take Mod Gearman and create service groups and host groups, so you can say, okay, this worker is only doing these jobs because it's only got these plugins. That makes it a lot simpler. So you could break it up that way too. But whatever you do, in my thinking anyway, you have to assume that all your workers are going to die and Nagios is still going to run. You don't want to create that dependency. If Nagios runs slower, okay, I can live with that, but I don't want it to be dependent on workers to be able to survive. So that's kind of how I look at it with Mod Gearman.
Like I use Mod Gearman environment. It's got about 10,000 Windows checks. Yeah, if those workers died, it would just bury our Nagios server. So it might as well be dead, right? So we run about 7 users.
Yeah, and that's so that's one of those issues that you have to make a decision about, is then you become dependent upon mod Gearman. And if you can avoid that, it'd be great, but you know, some situations, it's either distributed or dependency. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, there's a, wait for the, there he comes.
During a failover, if you don't have very many other workers, your resources are becoming constrained. Would it be prudent to implement something to decrease the amount of checks you're doing when you've failed over onto the slave?
And that's a interesting idea. I know that organizations have said, okay, if we do failover, this is the stuff that doesn't matter. And that's what you're saying, is who cares about the host check? If we can get a service check, we know that thing is up. So yeah, that makes sense. It does make it more complex. And that's one of the reasons that I didn't look at going down that path, but it does make sense, because there may be, 30% is what really matters. Then you could set it up. It would just make it a lot more complex to turn those kinds of things off. I guess the poor man's way of turning those off is never put those plugins on the slave, or the checks on the slave. It doesn't even know about them. Be getting a history possibly, but it would be a sloppy way to do it, but that would be an easy way to do it. But that is a good idea, and makes sense. Got a couple more minutes if you got a question you want to throw out.
How would you modify your model if you had 3 XI servers or a 3-site deployment?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So you have a distributed model.
In some cases, yes.
Yeah.
It's actually 3 individual hot sites, 3 different networks, but all kind of playing in the same one.
That would be a lot more difficult, because you're almost going to have to be, if in that kind of situation, I would be looking, first thing I would look at is virtualization, because you're probably not going to have the resources to have physical boxes, and so you could look at that virtualization of doing something similar with virtualized box. A lot of companies will say, hey, we don't have the money for the failover to be a physical box, but we're willing for it to be a virtual box that would run slower. We can still see stuff. We have some access. So that would probably be the easiest solution, instead of trying to combine them into something. I think it's going to be pretty complex to take one box and pull in everything, because it's probably not going to be able to do everything in the 3 boxes. And now maybe you're assuming that one box is going down, and so it only has to do a third, but there's some real complexities there. So I think I'd look at virtualization before anything else.
Thanks. Not really a question, but to get, and I don't know who said it, but the idea of having less services run on your slave, then to tie it with what you said, an external command as part of your check script that does the reload, changes your config files and all. You could have a non-critical group, service group or host group or whatever, send an external command as part of your reload that on the slave would disable 50% or whatever it is of your service checks or your host checks as part of your failover process. So that would take care of doing that pretty easily.
Good idea. So again, this whole concept, whatever you do, as you start pulling in these little pieces of ideas, you start to see things that will work better for your situation, and that's what you have to do. think there's a couple minutes left. So you got a couple minutes left to come up with a great idea here.
Has high availability been discussed in the Nagios Fusion kind of management overview? It's not in this course or this.
Yeah, I think you'd have to ask Mike if that was the case.
I'm sorry. It just seems that with the Nagios Fusion tactical overview, it's a great idea and it's kind of infancy, or it's, I think it has a lot of ways to grow. I just didn't know if this was kind of a dialogue to, address. It's just the topic of high availability in general is definitely something on our radar. I think we've kind of come to a lot of the same conclusions Mike has, where it's like there's not a perfect solution, and the challenge we run into is everybody who wants it, they want it to look and work differently. And so I think some of the idea with Fusion is to basically free it up, so if somebody, if they want to run 6 or 7 Nagios servers and even have, redundant ones for each of those, they can, and then you just view everything from Fusion. So we did a lot more work for aggregation of data in our 2012 version, so you can actually, if you want to see, summaries and view statistics and things like that, you can see that. And so we tried to, to kind of make the 2012 version a little more feature-rich so that people could, just have more options, use it that way.
Just related to a statement that you made, you can pull MySQL off the Nagios server and put it separate, and if so, could you even go to another relational database?
Instead of MySQL is what you're asking.
Right.
Again, you're going to have to ask somebody else. I wouldn't do that because I'm not qualified to say if that would work or not, but you'd have to talk to Nagios about that to see if that would work.
But do a lot of people pull MySQL to another server?
I teach, do training for Nagios and do consulting, and so I have access to a lot of different companies, and very few do it. It's an easy process, but they're scared. They're trying to get their Nagios up to speed, and this is kind of a secondary issue, but it's not that big a deal to put it on a different box. And the savings on an XI are considerable. If you're looking at lots of checks, it really makes sense to look at that option. And that option is probably easier than doing all of the other performance issues that you would have to do. I mean, you could eliminate things like MUD, Gearman, or DNX, or, depending on your size.
Yeah, that's why I like that. It seems like a simpler approach to gain a big chunk.
Yeah. And probably the biggest chunk that you can gain is to move off that MySQL.
Just to continue with talking about moving off the MySQL, when you do an upgrade to XI, do you have to do the upgrade on the MySQL box as well, or does the script know to go and talk to the SQL server and do it that way, or?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's simple.
There were in earlier versions, there were a couple of quirks we found with it, but as far as we know, it's fixed now. We've got a running test environment that's got MySQL offloaded, so we test all of our upgrades against it. So we've got several users that use it, perpetually like that, pretty big environments.
Isn't it true also, Mike, that even if you change the password from the standard Nagios XI, it asks you the question in the upgrade process, what's your password, and solves all those issues?
As far as we know, we've got all those
Okay, it's about time that we close, so thanks for participating.